Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk to you all this morning. Fifth London's calling. Again, a huge kudos to the 5 people who organised this fantastic event, especially with the week and all the situations in it. They've done marvellously to get us up and running. So my name is Barry Hughes. I'm the lead developer architect with Blue Wave Group. I tweeted Dev in the cloud. Today I'm going to talk to you about writing web components a bit. Especially about importing code into them. And all the code for this is on a GitHub repo on the link at the bottom. So if I can organize this. So a little bit about Blue Wave Group and myself before I start. Blue Wave Group are a platinum consultant partner based in the UK and Ireland. As you can see, we've got our fingers in many different clouds in the Salesforce universe. For my own part, I'm the lead developer architect with the company. I'm also the leader of the developer group based in Dublin in Ireland. If you're a member of the developer group, please, if you're not, please join. If you are, please get involved. You get an awful lot out of it. I'm also an author of 2 Pluralsight courses on component development, specifically on prototyping. Last March, this time last year, I was able to create a free Pluralsight course based on prototyping for Lightning Web Components. So I encourage you to look out for that. So I want to talk about Lightning Web Components today, which is new actually for London's calling. Last year, we didn't get a chance to talk about Lightning Web Components, not because it wasn't out, it had just been released, but the deadline for putting in presentations last year for London's calling had just passed when Lightning Web Components were announced in December 2018. They were announced at the New York World Tour and pretty quickly put out live in spring 19. And what we found, certainly as developers, and especially from a company like Blue Wave, we found that the learning curve was pretty good. We got running with them very fast. They were pretty much ready to deploy. We pretty much worked them through our process for a release, and then in the summer 19, we actually deployed our first Lightning Web Components. And a lot of news happened with Lightning Web Components and still continues to happen. So it was actually open sourced at Trello DX. And standard components themselves that we use in Lightning Web Components were also open sourced at Dreamforce. And now we can also do some local LWC development on our own computers without even using an org, which is kind of cool. And again, as I said, there's a lot of really good courses and some suppliers out there, especially from Salesforce themselves, who've been looking at some sample code that they've provided themselves. But today I want to go back almost to the start. And most Salesforce professionals, whether you're an administrator or a developer, have probably done what we're just showing you on screen right now, made your first Lightning Web Component. And this is what we're showing you here on the right-hand side is Visual Studio Code. You're running a command to create, in this case, a Lightning Web Component called hello binding. And we're saving it to a folder. And this creates a folder and 3 files, a JavaScript file, HTML file, and an XML file. And the only file that's really necessary is the JavaScript file, but you get all 3 here. Just a word of caution with this filing structure is that one of the most important things is that these files all share the same name and it is case sensitive. But when you create your very first Lightning Web Component, the first thing you see in JavaScript is these 2 lines. And this is new to most Salesforce developers, the idea of importing and exporting JavaScript code. It's pretty standard for most JavaScript developers, especially in the world of ES6, but this is new to a lot of Salesforce developers. So what exactly are imports and exports? What do these lines mean? And what else can we import and export? So it brings me on to talk about, in JavaScript, what are imports and exports? Now, these 2 files you see here, snippets of files, these are not actually in Salesforce at all. These are separate, regular JavaScript. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've got a JavaScript file that's got a class, with a constructor called user. I've also got 2 functions, print the user's name and print the user's age. Pretty straightforward stuff. On the right-hand side, we've got another JavaScript file, and this is actually, it's called main.js in my own structure. And you can see on the top line, we're importing code from the user.js file into our main.js file, which is where we want to work. This is very much akin to, in an ORA component, having a helper file being used from a controller code. In this case, we can import in our code, and the way it's imported is interesting. On the top of the file, in the user file, we've got an export default in front of the word class. Now, export default is extra lines, extra words. we can export one default thing. So we've decided in this case to export the class as default, which means that in our line on the right-hand side, it is import user. There's no braces around it because it is the default value we're bringing in there. And then we can also bring in, as you can see, print name and print age, which are the functions. These are available as exports as well. If the word export was not in front of them, on line 8 and line 12 on the left-hand side, you couldn't bring them in. But once we brought them in, and we bring them in from, and that's the data, the relative path to the JavaScript file, we can now use them. I can make a new user called Bob. He's age 30. I can print out who he is, the object. I can also print the username and print his age. And in this case, we're using print username as an alias of the print name function. So this is basic importing and exporting of JavaScript code. To go a little bit further, we can also extend JavaScript code. And by extending JavaScript code, we have a code on the right-hand side here, which is an exported class called animal. An animal has a name and a weight, and we can say whether he's eating or going to sleep or waking up. Very rudimentary code on the right-hand side to define a class, a type of animal. On the left-hand side, we've got a file called gorilla.js. We're going to describe a gorilla. And you can see on the fourth line down, we're actually calling super, name, weight. And that's actually calling the constructor of the parent. The only way this works is if we use the extends keyword for animal. So we're importing animal as a class, and then we're extending that animal object in here in our class gorilla, or to use both at the same time. And you can see down here, we're calling gorilla.pound chest, which returns he's pounding his chest, which is a function inside the main gorilla file itself. But we can also say from the super whether he's waking up, eating, or sleeping. The function on the left-hand side. Which brings me back to what we had at the start, where in Salesforce we're able to bring in an import and extend something we're bringing in. Come back to that in a second. And like the web components, we can do a very similar thing. We can make JavaScript files in our component code. So you can see on the left-hand side, I've got my hello binding component with its hello binding HTML, JavaScript, and XML file. I've also added some other files. I've added a user.js file on the root, just simply by making a new file on Visual Studio Code and added some JavaScript. Very similar to the JavaScript you saw in the previous screen. And we can also make a helper class, a helper folder or subfolders, and put our JavaScript in here. Once we import them in, we can import lots of fields in here. Let's just show you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of importing. So if we move over here to my browser, I'll start looking here at some of this code. In fact, let's look at Visual Studio Code. First thing we're going to look at is hello binding. This is the structure I showed you a few minutes ago. We've got hello binding here. First thing you'll notice here, we're actually bringing in something else. We're bringing in a contact sample. This is actually looking at another JavaScript file, which is here, sample contacts. And this is simply bringing across a constant. So we don't have to just export out a function. We can export a constant, a variable. In this case, just a load of JSON. This would be similar to querying records in Salesforce. We can use this for testing or for development if we don't want to call Salesforce. Kind of useful. And then we can import in our username, print age, just as I did before. I'm also bringing in some other values in terms of comparison code. This is what I've written here to compare code. We'll see this in a little while. But I'm able to run this code and see what's going on with it. Hello binding. Let's show you that for a second. So in hello binding, let's show you the console logging out here. So in hello binding, let's close all this off. And the idea is if I change my value here, it's going to call user. And you can see here it's saying handle name, name to page, and it's actually going, okay, saying hi to Bob. And that's the idea here, saying hi to Bob. Let's move on to another function, using another functionality. This is an actual example from the sample library gallery you can get with Salesforce. And this is actually fetching external data from another system. So in here, we're doing a fetch out to an external address and getting back information. We had like 100 records, and we're going to sort these records out. Now in here, we're actually importing in fetch data helper, which is actually here. This is what's doing the call out. Here's our address we're doing the call out from and getting it back. So that's another import. We actually import in external features. We can go and do call outs with them. And here we've got an example of something I'm calling sort data. And sort data, something what's happening here is when I'm getting back the data, I'm sorting it by certain direction here. And in the code, this is the lightning data table that I'm using to display this. And we're seeing when I click on a header, I'm doing a sort. And if I click on update data sorting, it's going to call the exact same data. It's going to get a copy of the data here, and it's going to sort it, depending on what I'm sorting it by. So here's our fake data fetcher that we just showed you a minute ago. I've got some code here we're going to click on. We actually order some code. So let's say we want to order the balance. Tap on this, it will reorder the code. And that's using my own code I use to sort it out. I can also sort out based on different values in here. All these values record based on their types. It's very useful. And in our code, all we've done is called a sort data function. Now that sort data function is imported in from my sorting.js file. Let's go find it. It's in the helpers, sorting.js. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just getting some values. This is very much standard stuff you get off the web, how I sort some stuff. I'm basically sorting it out in a very generic way. So we can then use this, not just in this particular object, in this component, but in many others. And again, those two Lightning Web components are in the GitHub repo. A few gotchas though when it comes to adding imports into your code. If you try to import JavaScript from a file, that file must be correct. So in this case on the top, I tried to import in and that file helper sample contacts one does not exist. That will actually fail, it won't compile. Sometimes though, you put things in that will compile. So on my next line, you see I'm bringing in a print namee as print username. This one actually will save, even though the name print name, sorry, this one will fail. The print namee does not exist. So print namee doesn't exist. I'm trying to put it as an alias. It will check that one. And if I don't have an export of function called print namee, which I don't, it's called print name, this line will actually fail compilation. However, you'll see on the next line, I've actually added in print dob as another piece of functionality that I want to import. Print dob doesn't exist. This actually will save. But if you try to run it, obviously it'll fail. Another point to note is that where can I put these files? So basically, these files can be put into a directory inside your LWC, or it can be put into the LWC root itself. The third way it can happen is we can make a component. I'll just pull out and show it to you. We can make a component. In this case, I've made one called user. And this is all the code I needed for that user code. And if I want to bring that into my JavaScript, I can simply bring in as an import using C/user. This actually imports in JavaScript from another Lightning Web component. So we can reuse our JavaScript code in that way. One thing we cannot do is we cannot create any kind of folder inside the LWC directory itself. So we can say, make a new folder here called scripts and try to add scripts. This is not allowed. It will not be saved to the Salesforce org. So we can't do that. So when we import in from another org, as I just showed you, we use C/ and the name of another component. This example here is actually taken directly from the LWC recipes sample org in the sample gallery. This is where they're actually importing in some information to do with finance. We're getting terms of a particular product. We're calculating the monthly payment calculation, and these are both exported here. In this case, we're putting the export at the bottom. This happens, Node.js developers tend to do this more often, but we could have put export in front of the constants if we really wanted to. And then we import in from that component. So it doesn't have to be a JavaScript file inside the directory. It can be another component we can reuse throughout all of our Lightning Web components, which is probably far better. Now, in Lightning Web components, one of the biggest learning curves for most developers is not just knowing what imports are, but what we can import. And there are many standard things we can import, many of which most Lightning Web component developers will know already. So Lightning Element when we just showed a minute ago, Lightning Element allows us to bring in things like LWC core, brings in Lightning Element, and also we can bring in API, track, and app wire. Most people know what these are. API means that we can bring in, make public properties in our component. We can put in from, let's say, the Lightning App Builder. Track is something that's not used very much anymore. It's been deprecated a lot in Spring 20 to allow variables to be refreshing across the browser. And wire lets us call Apex or use the Lightning Data Service. But there are lots more that we can use. Some of them begin with the word Lightning. These are more generic things to do with user interface. So things like getting access to user interface API and also showing toasts, things like that. On the right-hand side, we've got an awful lot of imports with @Salesforce in front of them. And these really talk to the other parts of the platform, like Apex classes, what your form factor is of the browser you're using, international codes, custom labels, the new message channel, resource URLs, things of that nature, bringing in static resources. On the left-hand side, then at the bottom, we have things like bringing in information in terms of bringing in big JavaScript libraries. We're using Platform Resource Loader. We'll see that in a few minutes. And also, we can do tests using imports as well. So this is like one example of one of the standard imports. I'm not going to go through all of them. Quite a boring session if I did. They're all very well documented in Developer Guide. But this is an example of using jest tests. And in our jest test functionality, we want to test our Lightning Web Components. We make a JavaScript file just like this one so that we can run them with SFDX. As you can see on the top of it, you have two imports. One from LWC. Now, previously we brought in Lightning Element from LWC when you make a standard Lightning Web Component. Lightning Element is really the same as HTML element in normal web development. We can get access to the front end of Salesforce pretty much. But Create Element allows us to create a component in a virtual DOM for testing. And then we're importing the actual component we're going to test, which in this case is a component called hello. The describe here gives us a name. So this test is called see hello. And the after each here is very simple. It's just simply clearing off the virtual DOM. And then the IT line is an actual test. And you can see we are doing const element get create element at the bottom. And we're creating see hello, which is creating the hello component for testing. At the very bottom, we're actually just checking out to see what's in that component. So you can see two imports here that are importing in create element from LWC and the hello component. And we've assumed here, by the way, we've also installed Jest in your project. But we can run our tests in that way. So just the way the imports work for one particular aspect. Which brings us on to a bigger point. And this is where this session kind of came from. Showing people how to import and export code that you create yourself or using standard Salesforce code. But from the world of Node.js and people using JavaScript for the last 12, 15 years of using Node.js, there's a huge number of JavaScript libraries and code bases out there that we can use to make our lives a lot easier. And there's a lot of them out there. This is only a very small sample. Two in particular, just to point out on this screen, is Chart.js and D3js. Two very, very powerful language platforms for making charts, but also very good in that there are working examples of these in the sample gallery that Salesforce have created. So the Salesforce developer evangelist team have made these sample live galleries, and Chart.js and D3js are two very good examples of code using that. But I'm going to focus on two others. These are the two that if you're starting off to learn Node.js or advanced JavaScript, these are the first two you're kind of showing. They're very much utility JavaScript libraries. The one on the right called Moment.js is what most people learn first. It's an incredibly solid, stable library that allows us to manipulate time and dates. On the left-hand side, we're going to go through Lodash underscore. So Lodash underscore is a fantastic utility library. We're going to see some of that working right now. So let's give you a quick demo. We're going to show you a demo from a scratch order I've created. One second here. Yeah. So this is another little got you in terms of using JavaScript. So previously I showed you either a local development instance of Salesforce running. I was able to do this because I was bringing on my own JavaScript file, which is very small, into a Lightning Web component. It didn't really take that much time for it to run. It loads almost instantly. When it comes to very big libraries like Lodash, like D3, like chart.js. The issue is that these JavaScript libraries are quite big. So we have to be able to load them up from somewhere. And in this case, I'm loading up from a static resource. The problem though is that if I'm loading up JavaScript from a static resource, local development servers won't pick them up. So you have to actually test this one. In this case, I'm using an Aura application, and I'm passing in my Lightning Web Component into this to show it off to you. Before I show it to you in action, let's just have a quick look at the code behind this. And this is a component called Top Opportunities. It's already in the GitHub library. So in this, we have very simple, it's just a table displaying some opportunities. In this case, I'm actually getting all the opportunities in an org. This is very much a sample. This is not really meant for production. In a JavaScript file, we're doing a few extra stuff. I'm not bringing in a particular JS file I've created myself. I'm bringing in two major libraries, Lodash and Moment.js. In order to do that, we have to use another import. We're using one of the ones I showed you before, Platform Resource Loader, and we're actually using the load script module from that library. What we're going to do here is we're going to use this to load up our two libraries, Lodash and Moment.js. And you can see here I've got references in there. These are references to static resources, at least they have static resources. So if we go down further on, we can see that I'm, first of all, in my connected callback, I'm loading up Moment.js. Moment.js is being initialized. And this is how you know it's loading script. This is the function I brought in. I'm loading up Moment.js. And as soon as it's done, it will know it's done. And what I've done is I've chained this. So once Moment.js is loaded up, I'm loading up Lodash. Very similar code and loading them up. And once I've loaded them up, I'm simply running some code to get some data. And this get opportunity list is calling some Apex, which is a simple Stockholm query getting back some data, some opportunities. And this is kind of where things get kind of nice. So if we look at the result of this code before we go any further, you can see here that I'm loading up all of my information here. Pretty straightforward. But you can see I'm ordering it in a specific way. Go back to the code here, you'll see how I'm organizing it. So I'm ordering this using amount and close date. And the amount is in descending order, and the close date is in ascending order. You can see the close date in ascending order. Amount, you see the highest amount is on top. So how did I do this? How did I actually order it? Well, I use Lodash. So Lodash has got a lot of very, very powerful tools to do it. One is called order by I'm using here. Lodash, all the documentation for Lodash is pretty much here. If I look at the documentation, you can see on the left-hand side, it's going to come up with all sorts of functionality you can get. One of them is called order by. And mainly it's ways to organize and loop through and process your data, process your JSON in JavaScript. And one of them is called order by. In this case, I'm doing order by whatever data I have, and I have to get the amount and close date, which is two variables that I cause in the JSON, and how I order them. One line of code, and I'm able to order all that code, which is kind of cool. You'll also see here I'm able to do some for each code. So it's very similar like web components. This is LWC doing a for each, a loop. This is underscore doing a for each. Very, very similar. I have the loop throughout the code. And then the final thing I'm doing is on the right-hand side of my code, I'll go back to my example, you can see I've got some calculation on here. How long ago was this particular record? And these are all based in 2018, quite a long, consider 2 years ago. How did I find out they were 2 years ago? Well, in my code, I'm using Moment. So Moment.js is the other library I'm using. And again, one line of code. I'm getting Moment, and I'm getting the close date from each individual row, defining the date. This is the OR format which it came in. And it's very simple from now. How long ago has it been since that date? So Moment.js, just look at the quickly on the website for Moment.js, you'll see huge amount of documentation. This is very straightforward. Just make sure to bring in the correct libraries as static resource to make sure it works. But as you can see here, we've got a huge amount of stuff going on here. If I do a quick search for order by, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. So they've got a huge amount of guides in terms of how to work it, how to add a week, for example, to a variable, and clone variables in that a week, and format based on whatever way you want to format it. So it's a huge amount of information here, again, including times and lots of manipulation of dates and times. And that's pretty much what I did here. And again, this code is all available in my GitHub repo. So in terms of the resources I used here, I used quite a few, going through this to find out the best way to explain how imports and exports work, and then how we can bring in some of those fantastic libraries that are out there. We can reuse them. To get a repo, as I said, github.com barryhughes1/importables. And the sample gallery, the second link there, is fantastic. It's where a lot of samples you can get. Some of the stuff that are in this presentation is from there. And again, a few more useful links besides. And thank you very much for your attention.
Blockchain can help feed more people. And AI can help care for people. VR can help train people. Let's use technology for people to make a greater good in every community, every day. Accenture. New applied now.